So this is Reddit, huh? Up until a couple of hours ago, I'd not been aware of this corner of the internet. In fact, up until a couple of hours ago, I'd not been aware that the internet itself exists. Yet browsing through this forum, reading all these harrowing accounts of personal misfortune and watching videos of people's sanity slipping away in public, I feel like I'll quickly make myself at home here. You must be wondering what happened tonight, why the air feels so oppressive, why the stars are shining down like 1,000 shapeless eyes. And I will tell you in time. But the body that I have taken is old. These withered fingers struggle and shake against the keyboard. They need to be warmed up. Before I speak of this night, I want to tell you a story. A story of a plague hundreds of years in the past. It will help you understand. It all sounded like a horrid tale to scare small children, or perhaps like a political provocation. Nonetheless, the stories that the merchants told did not sound real. Yet all across the empire, in the quaint villages, in the industrious towns, in the bustling cities, the merchants would tell the exact same story. Vienna had been taken by the plague. The streets were filled with hundreds, no, thousands of dead. Chaos and crime and flames had taken control in the capital. The royal seat of the Habsburgs had tasted the thundering wrath of God. And soon the rest of the empire would join its suffering. The more the merchants drank, the more detailed their stories became. They spoke of wailing mothers, of shambling corpses, of family trees snuffed out through festering pustules. The more the merchants spoke, the less they were believed. The other patrons of the bar would complain of the stench of alcohol on the merchants' breaths. Only a drunkard would think that a city such as Vienna could be shaken by a mere sickness. But by the time morning arrived, the patrons would slowly come to learn that the story they had heard was not a fiction. Yes, the exhausted travelers reeked of alcohol as they told their mad tale, but there was something else on their breath as they spoke in those tightly packed pubs. A microscopic seal of authenticity, which the patrons soon became intimately familiar with. A plague breeds despair. There is only so much pain and suffering that a human mind can witness before it closes in on itself. The world outside becomes a morbid facsimile of what it was. Sickness seizes the land. Thoughts of a life without the constant presence, fear became a distant memory. In this new demented world, one does not investigate the logic of things. One simply does whatever is in their power to survive, be it with sanity or without. When the corpse pickers descended upon Bohemia, no one inquired where they came from. There were bloated corpses in the streets that needed to disappear, and the haggard-looking men seemed more than willing to provide transport on their rickety carts. The common folk presumed that the bodies were being carted away to a mass grave, or to one of the fire pits that were so prevalent in the beginning of the outbreak. But the bodies which the corpse pickers collected were not destined for disposal. No, they were destined for something much greater. The corpse pickers traveled with their cadaver-filled carts towards the heart of the continent, the capital of Bohemia, the Golden City, Prague. Yet before they would reach the towering Gothic gates, they would veer off to a nearby forest, The wooden wheels would groan on the unkept forest roads, chunks of liquefied flesh would drip from the edges of their carts, but as arduous as the journey was, the corpse pickers didn't complain. They knew that their task was of an unimaginable cosmic importance. With sunken eyes and empty stomachs, they worked away at their duty. Hidden within the dark forest was a clearing in which hundreds of years ago men similar to the corpse pickers had dug their mark into the earth. The corpse pickers knew nothing of the previous failed construction attempts in the meadow. They knew nothing of the rituals that the church had foiled. All they knew was that they were servants of Otto Knoch. Before the plague, while his family was still alive, when his thoughts were still his own, Otto would have nightmares. They were implacable things. As soon as the man would wake up, whatever concrete fears that had haunted him in his dreams would become wisps of smoke from a fire that he could not place, visions of meadows and bones and whispered secrets. Otto did not make much of these haunts. Whenever the night terrors arose, he would simply walk through his home and remind himself of his life. His wife was caring and spoke no ill of him. His daughters were beautiful enough to be married into powerful families, and Adam, his eldest, had enthralled the intelligentsia in Vienna enough to be admitted to a prestigious university. Otto, however, was not just wealthy in terms of his family, through a bloodline tied closely enough to the Habsburgs to provide power, but far enough away to not provide birth defects. Otto was able to secure employment as a royal architect in Prague. The home that he inhabited in the heart of the city still left him in awe in terms of its sheer size and luxury. The knowledge that his works would tower through the ages still made him smile. The joy of his good fortune still met him every morning. The occasional nightmare seemed only fair. It balanced the state of things. When the haunts made a return to sleep untenable, Otto would grab his pipe and go out on his balcony. One of his friends, the same one that suggested Adam become a doctor, told Otto that a bit of tobacco in the evening would be good for his humors. A restless mind needed something hot and dry to calm. Otto was partial to agree. After a couple puffs on his pipe and a bit of stargazing, he would forget about the whole ordeal and was ready to go to bed. It was just a nightmare, after all. He was a resilient man. He wasn't going to let a bad dream get to him. Yet before he pulled the curtains shut, Otto would stare out at the sky for just a couple of moments. I can't help but to think that somewhere inside, he knew. He knew the stars were watching him. He knew those visions weren't simple nightmares. The fortunes of the empire shifted, as did Otto's luck. In the span of a week, the bustling markets that were outside of Otto's courtyard were replaced with a hasty construction. The people were desperate. The sickness had to be stopped. A plague pillar was being put up. Surely God would see it and take pity upon his followers. Yet the God that they worshipped had no eyes for them. Even after the monument was unveiled, the death continued. Soon enough, the streets went quiet. All Otto could hear through his window were rattling carts and insane ramblings about the Empire's Jewry. Otto's projects were suspended, but he had been frugal enough to not worry about money. What truly weighed on the architect's heart was the fate of his son. When Adam had left for Vienna, his correspondence was detailed and regular. But as soon as the plague doctors were summoned, his letters ceased. Otto attempted to remain optimistic. Surely his son's letters had simply gotten lost in the chaos. But there was doubt in his thoughts. Otto's wife feared the worst. The night terrors became regular occurrences. Every night Otto would wake in a cold sweat, his mind still stuck in the dreamscape. Somewhere out there in the recesses of his mind was a tower, just like the plague column the peasants outside of his home had constructed. Yet the structure of his nightmares wasn't made of stone. The structure of his nightmares wasn't made for a forgiving God. Regardless of how freakish his dreams had become, however, Otto remained steadfast. He stopped looking at the stars and busied himself with speculative work on new constructions. In his occupation, he found a semblance of solace, yet his work required a concentrated mind, and soon enough, his daughters made that impossible. As soon as Otto's wife noticed the serving girl coughing, she removed her from the home. But she was too late. The disease was in the home. Otto and his wife went through a gentle case of the deadly disease. They were weak and feverish, but their ill health was incomparable to their children's ailments. The best doctor gold could buy was dispatched for, but he made no difference. With his daughters on death's door and no word of Adam, Otto soon became seized with the realization that he was to outlive his children. His wife prayed to drown out the sounds of their daughter's feverish suffering. Otto simply listened. Their rattling cough sounded like bones being crushed up in a monstrous maw. He was the one who found them. It was during one of his midnight smoking sessions that he decided to walk down and check on his daughters. They died together, their bodies embraced in a desperate hug. Otto wept at the edge of their bed, his blood hot with fury against whatever god that would turn his daughters from children to corpses. But it was between those tears that he heard the voice. "Take them outside," I whispered.
"Those that will take care of them are on their way."
His sobbing stopped. He listened to hear my voice again, but I did not need to speak. Otto recognized the voice from his dream, and it did chill his blood to hear me in his waking state. But he also recognized he wanted to spare his wife the horrid, bloated visage. Otto obeyed his first command. By the time he had dragged the sheet outside, they were already waiting for him. The two men outside looked horribly destitute. Their hair was unkempt and unshaven, their clothes were worn past their years, and both of the men wore the signs of exhaustion on their face. Yet they had a cart at the ready, and something in the back of Otto's soul told him they were the people who would dispose of his burden. The corpse pickers wordlessly loaded up his daughters onto their cart and then disappeared into the night. His wife was furious. She wanted a Christian funeral for her children, not to have them dragged off in the middle of the night by corpse pickers. Otto had few words for her. He scarcely understood his own mind by then. All he knew was that he had to find some hope to stay sane. Perhaps some new arrivals in the court would have news of Vienna. Perhaps someone would assure him that Adam was still alive. He sat in the room where months prior she told her daughters fairy tales. Her mind was flooded with incomprehensible grief. Those little girls were gone. Her son was gone as well. How would she live without them? A voice whispered to her through the windowsills. I told her where Otto kept the flintlock. While Otto was desperately clawing for information in the castle, a pistol shot echoed through his home. The architect was one step closer to his destiny. The corpse pickers took her away. Otto was left alone in his home. No matter how high the ceiling stretched, how plentiful the rooms of his house were, Otto felt trapped. The rest of the building was irrelevant. Reality had been distilled down to him, the blood-stained room and the pistol that lay on the floor. His fingers twitched with want. Somewhere in him there was a need to pick up the flintlock and place it back in its case. But he also knew that if he felt the cold steel of the gun, he would simply load and shoot.
"Just go on a walk. Just walk away."
A gentle voice drifted in through the open window. Otto left the weapon on the roof and set out on the street. He wandered aimlessly through the city, or at least he thought he wandered aimlessly. In truth, all of his steps were carefully planned by a mind that was not his own. It was not necessary to order Otto to take a specific direction. No puppet strings were needed. With the mere suggestion of a path, his hopeless soul followed. Otto chose to walk through the dirty streets. He chose to walk out of those Gothic gates and past the villages and down those forest paths. In his mind, he ended up in the meadow on his own accord. The hole in the ground, the surrounding trees, the air of oppression, it all seemed so familiar to him. It didn't take Otto long to recognize that the meadow in which he was standing was the same place he had seen in his dreamscape. The only thing that was missing was the column of bones. In its stead, there was what appeared to be a pile of rags. Otto moved closer to investigate. He did not need to walk far. However, the shifting wind revealed the true nature of the pile soon enough. The unquestionable, inescapable stench of rot filled Otto's nostrils. What was before him was not a pile of old rags, it was a heap of bloated, decomposing corpses.
"What do you wish us to do, Master Knoch?"
a chorus of voices asked. Behind Otto stood a grouping of the corpse pickers, each more disheveled than the other. Their eyes looked at Otto with religious adoration.
"Your will is our command. What do you wish us to do, Master Knoch?"
In the back of his throat there were words that were edging to come out, words that seemed to have seeped into his skull from a foreign place, words that he knew would ease his suffering as soon as they left his lips. But Otto refused to listen to the voices that echoed through his head. He fled the strange disheveled men of the meadow and ran all the way back to his spacious home. The nightmares got worse. Otto did whatever was in his power to set off sleep. He read, he smoked, he even managed to find a source of coffee from the royal court. Yet the visions that Otto lost because of lack of sleep came back to him in his waking life. The whispers, the flashes of another world, they all became undeniable. A tower reaching up towards the night sky, made of things that were once alive. Its sharp, hooked spires reach towards the darkened heavens. They grasp at the stars. Those glowing orbs shine like 100 eyes in the night. They're watching. They're waiting. They are here to welcome the 100-eyed god.
"Clean the bones,"
Otto would find himself muttering under his breath as he wandered his house. That was what the voice in the back of his head wanted him to say to the corpse pickers. At first, it made no sense, but as the visions became more distinct, the puzzle pieces of his nightmarish existence started to fall into place. He knew that giving the order would free him of the dread that lingered at the pit of his soul. But he also knew that as soon as he ordered those mysterious, dirty peasants to act, he would be trapped in something much more horrid. For days he resisted that eldritch call. He wandered the court in search of news about Adam. He contemplated the escape route that the flintlock pistol offered. He did whatever was in his power to ignore the yearning to go back to the meadow. But Otto was simply not strong enough. One day he found himself walking out of the city. He knew where his feet were leading him. He was too tired to stop them. The stench and size of the pile had grown since he had last seen it, but the devotion of the corpse pickers remained the same. They stood by the hill of corpses with bottomless adoration in their hollow eyes.
"What do you wish us to do?"
they asked in unison. "Clean the bones." As soon as the words left his lips, a surge of relaxation pulsed through his body. His knees buckled beneath the unbearable lightness that he suddenly felt in his heart. Otto sat down in the grass and watched the corpse pickers work. They took the bodies one by one and stripped them down to the bone. Some of the flesh had become so tender that it neatly slipped off, whilst the fresher limbs required visible force. Yet regardless of the effort, the result was the same. A pile of picked bones started to manifest next to the corpses, and chunks of flesh rolled down into the hole at the center of the meadow.
The presence of death will bring him closer,
I whispered to Otto.
The 100-eyed god requires a sacrifice of life if he is to be summoned.
My words calmed his nervous soul. Watching the corpse pickers work let Otto forget about the plague, about his family, about the helpless nature of his mortal coil. He was now a part of something bigger. His life would be given meaning through his actions. Otto was going to help usher in an incomprehensible force. "Stack the bones," he whispered, as the sun started to set. Even though the corpse pickers were hard at work hauling the bodies and stripping the flesh, they reacted to his order immediately. The crowd split in two. Half the corpse pickers continued to work at the flesh, whilst the others started to stack the bones, together, into pallets. The strange project that was slowly taking shape in front of Otto's eyes filled the man with a shuddering calmness. This was what his life was now. He was overseeing the construction of a monument for the 100-eyed god. He woke up in his bed with faint memories. In the back of his skull there were images of a dark forest, of him stumbling through the streets of Prague as the sun burnt his exhausted eyes. He knew he had somehow gotten home, but the specifics of the journey eluded him behind a thick mental fog. Otto woke up in his own house, but he knew he was needed elsewhere. He let his feet lead him back to the meadow. In times of obsession, time dilates. Every second that Otto spent at the construction was drenched in passionate perfection. What was being erected in front of him was beautiful. Each bone was laid in the exact spot that the universe had intended for it. There was a chaotic elegance to the way the rib cages interlocked into thick rings of sharpness. The hours that Otto had spent in the meadow were the happiest moments of his life. Yet when he tried to think back to them, to a specific moment, he couldn't. The days blurred into one long night of watching the skeletal tower rise from the ground, intercut with a blaring, cruel sun that ushered in the day as he stumbled through the streets. He would wake in his bed with the gentlest idea of the life he once lived, of the joy his family had brought him. But then it would all be washed away by his responsibilities. As the tower of bones grew taller, and the weeks turned into months, his morning nostalgia faded away as well. The only thing that Otto was capable of thinking about was his duty to the 100-eyed god. "Father?" He stood at the foot of Otto's bed. For a second, Otto feared that one of the corpse pickers had followed him home. The youth that stood before him was unshaved and wore tattered clothes. Yet there was a light in his eyes. He was not some mindless worker, he was Adam. My son. He recognized him. The two hugged and cried and tried to make sense of the world together. The thought of the bone spire completely slipped Otto's mind. I tried as hard as I could to sink my whispers into his brain, but the man was simply too occupied seeing his son come back from the dead. The partial family reunion seeped away at the dread that allowed me to control Otto. It seemed like my efforts had been in vain. The architect of the Bone Spire would push aside the madness of his work to be a father. The perceived lunacy of the construction would be confined solely to his mind, and when he would die, the memory of the meadow would die with him. I thought I'd lost him, but I did not. Adam talked at length of his life in Vienna. He told his father of how the plague had steadily chipped away at the city until nothing but chaos remained. He talked of his struggle to find food, to make his way back home. Otto carefully listened to the plight of his son and assured his child that he would never let such suffering meet him again. Yet as the sun rose over the skyline of the city, Otto was reminded of his own suffering. That blaring ball of fire that would scorch his eyes whenever he stumbled back home from the bone spire loosened his lips. He told Adam about the construction. Adam didn't understand. Surely his father wasn't stumbling out to the meadows to oversee a construction made of bones, under the directions of a whispering eldritch voice. Surely his father was simply speaking in metaphors. But he wasn't. As that dreaded sunlight filled the room, Otto's words became more plain. There were men out in the woods who tore away at the flesh of corpses to free the bone. These men were acting under his orders. The instructions that he gave them were not words of his own composition. Otto was speaking for a demented voice that dwelled deep in his chest. Adam demanded to see the construction. Otto was beyond exhausted, but he knew that he could not rest if the maddening images of the spire were in his mind alone. The father and son walked to the meadow. As they walked through the forest path, Adam started to choke back coughs. Food had been scarce on his journey back to Prague, but even the little bit of bread that he had in his stomach wanted out. "Father!" The youth dry heaved. "Do you not smell it?" He didn't. Otto could sense something in the air, a gentle smell of rot that danced through the forest, but the scent didn't disagree with him. It was simply the smell of his work. It was work that needed to be done. Even though the tower was made of brittle human bones, there was an air of stability that lingered behind it. Even though it was constructed by men who were scarcely more than skin-draped skeletons, a momentous power surrounded the construction. "Father, you cannot be here," his son whispered. "What is happening here? It's not Christian. Whomever these men are, whatever they are constructing, Father, this is an affront to humanity. The plague has driven you mad. Please, let's go home, Father." But Adam's pleading words did not reach Otto's ears. As he gazed upon the jagged monument he had helped build, an irresistible pride blossomed in his chest. Otto was a part of something bigger, of something inconceivable. Otto was a servant of the 100-eyed God. His spirit loosened. He let me speak through him. "Go home, son," he said. "I have work to do." Adam tried to speak calmly. Then he started to argue. Then he started to shout. It made no difference. His father's mind was elsewhere. His father's mind was entangled in the cosmic importance of the bone spire. All throughout the argument, the corpse pickers continued to strip and stack the bones, completely ignoring the father and son. When Adam laid a hand on his father, however, when he wanted to drag Otto back to their home and contact one of the royal physicians, the work ceased. The corpse pickers crowded the youth and removed him from the meadow. Otto didn't mind. He had to concentrate on his work. That was the last time Otto would ever see his son. The meadow was his home now. Adam made further attempts to rescue his father from the clutches of his work, but whenever he approached the meadow, the corpse pickers would be there to block his way. If he persisted, if he attempted to push past them to get to his father, the corpse pickers would be there to beat him until he relented. After weeks of attempting to break through, Adam gave up. He started to drink. To remove the need for Otto to leave the construction, a small wooden cottage was put together by the corpse pickers. Otto's days blurred back into one long stay at the construction site, with flashes of the sun breaking apart the nights. The corpse pickers became more numerous. There were more bodies to be brought in, more bones to be cleaned, more work to be done on the construction. Yet, As time dragged on, other people joined the procession of the meadow. Exhausted artisans carrying the fruits of their labor, hungry bakers with hands full of bread, manic merchants who let their gold spill down into the hole that had before festered with rotting flesh. They came each night, tired and afraid, but tied by their souls to a power much greater than them. Their low chants echoed through the forest. "He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he shall walk the earth. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon his eyes shall judge our souls. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he will arrive." The column was almost finished. Its peak lumbered among the treetops, reaching up towards the heavens, grasping for the stars that shined in the night like hundreds of glaring eyes. Otto knew that his work was nearly complete. Soon the 100-eyed god would answer the call. Yet, on the evening when the moment of arrival seemed imminent, when the crowds and chants had grown to an undeniable size, when the air was thick with electricity and the stars watched the world below with fascination, they came. They rode through the forest on horses carrying banners of a false god, singing hymns of false prophets. They came with swords and fire and muskets and crossbows. The warriors of the church descended upon the meadow and destroyed all that Otto had worked for. The last thing that the architect saw was the Tower of Bones crashing down to the ground. His magnificent structure broke into jagged fractures of bones as soon as it hit the earth. Then a sword of a fanatic pierced his chest and ended his life. Within moments, the gathering that was meant to usher in a new era of humanity was burned and crushed into oblivion. It was all Adam's work. When he first started drinking, he spoke of Otto Knoch's obsession in obtuse terms. His father was slaving away at a strange project with strange people. He had gone mad after the deaths that had plagued his family, but as the mead and beer and schnapps seeped away at his tongue, Adam's words became more direct. His drunken ramblings soon became a rumor that spread through the empire. Somewhere near Prague, in a secluded forest meadow, there was a man building a column made of bones. It was only a matter of time before the story reached the church. A couple of months after the bone spire had been torn down, Adam's body was found in the river. The man died a drunk, not knowing that he was directly responsible for his father's death, not knowing that his loose tongue had prevented the arrival of the 100-eyed god. You might find yourself with questions. Why am I telling you this story? How do I know all this? Who am I? I use the tale of Otto Knoch to illustrate that what happened over the past couple months is nothing new. Plagues have always bred despair. There have always been desperate minds that have levitated towards the darkness in times of crisis. Prayers and servitude to the 100-eyed god are nothing new. Every time that death is spread through the land, the whispered truths in the darkness have taken hold of weaker minds. The attempts to summon the 100-eyed god have always been foiled, be it by the church, be it by the government, be it by other groups that operate beneath the awareness of the public. The attempts to summon the 100-eyed god have always been foiled. Until tonight. The way the air bristles with electricity, the way the stars stare down at the world below, it is not a simple figment of your imagination. It is a sign that the 100-eyed God walks the earth. And as for my identity, the question of how I was able to tell Otto's tale with such detail, it's because I was there. I lingered in the shadows when his life was whole, and I walked through the darkness as it slowly fell apart. I whispered in his ear every step of the way, and I pulled the puppet strings when the moment required it. I type these words through the arthritic fingers of an old fisherman, but my identity should not be much of a mystery.